Hello all, back to lesson 23, lecture 2. So let us look at Caesar's consulship as it was represented in Suetonius's Life of Caesar. So here we are, 59 BCE. Now you remember the basic rules about being a consul ever since liberty was declared, right, in at the end of the monarchy, and then the last king was exiled. So usually we expect dating in this period in a consulship as in the consulship of X and Y. So for example, if there are two consuls, for example, in the year 59 was the consulship of Julius Caesar and of another man, Bibulus. So it should be usually in the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus. But this is what Suetonius has to say. Done in the consulship of Julius and Caesar, instead of Bibulus and Caesar, what they were writing down, the same meant twice by name and by surname. So the joke here, obviously this is an anecdote, is that people sort of say that Caesar was so powerful, and you recall how Bibulus spent much of the year withdrawn from politics, that people thought it was a consulship of Julius and Caesar, really implying something along the lines of what we will later see with Pompey of essentially someone being a sole consul. So this was not technically true like it was true for Pompey, but it was the case that Julius Caesar was just incredibly powerful, much more powerful than his fellow consul Bibulus. And then there is this text continues, another kind of little verse gets quoted. So presently too, the following verses were on everyone's lips. In Caesar's year, not Bibulus, an act took place of late. For nothing, not, do I remember done in Bibulus's consulate. Again, the joke is that this was just Caesar's year. It wasn't a year of two consuls, as it should be, or as it was technically the case. So Suetonius also addresses the Gallic campaign of Caesar, which you recall, starting after his consulship, allowed him the claim for incredible military success. So let's see what he has to say. During the 9 years of his command, this is in substance what he did. All that part of Gaul, which is bounded by the Pyrenees, the Alps and the Cevennes, and by the Rhine and Rhone rivers, a circuit of some 3,200 miles, he reduced to the form of a province and imposed upon it a yearly tribute of 40 million sesterces. So one of the things that might stand out to you as you're listening to this lecture, you might get worried. Oh my gosh, will I have to remember 3,200 miles for 40 million sesterces? You don't, no worries. What's interesting about it is this attachment to huge numbers, right? These are impressive numbers. It's kind of like when people start to say, I don't know, $100 million at a certain point, it's very hard for us to have a clear sense of like how much money we are actually talking about. So clearly huge military accomplishments, and then province, and that province means taxation income for the Romans. Also, we read here, he was the first Roman to build a bridge and attack the Germans beyond the Rhine. Okay, so it's even pushed beyond the Gauls, and he inflicted heavy losses upon them. He invaded the Britons too, a people unknown before, vanquished them, and exacted monies and hostages. Now, you might be entertained by this because we do know that historically speaking, even though Caesar indeed crossed over the Rhine and attacked the Germans, and then also crossed the Channel and attacked the Brits, at the same time, neither one of these were incredibly successful campaigns. And you can kind of notice if you just read carefully when we get texts like he inflicted heavy losses or he vanquished them and exacted monies and hostages. What's missing there are the numbers, right? So there is really not so much to claim concretely. But even more importantly, it shows us, though, that Caesar clearly must have been advertising these successes in his Gallic campaign. There is another bit that we can also notice, and this is in relation to crossing the Rubicon in 49 BCE. So this is, you recall, is when he has to sort of choose if he is going to stand for consulship in Rome, in which case he would have to leave his army behind. So this is how Suetonius depicts this really dramatic moment in Caesar's life. So this is sections 31, 32, if you are following along in the online text. Then overtaking his cohorts at the river Rubicon, which was the boundary of his province, he paused for a while and realizing what a step he was taking. By the way, what step is that? Civil war, are we on in picture? He turned to those about him and said, even yet, we may draw back, but once crossed that little bridge, the whole issue is with the sword. Right? And then so he clearly realizes that this is war. If he crosses that bridge on that not very big river, if we are even sure where it is, then it's going to be civil war. As he stood in doubt, this sign was given him. Suddenly there appeared a being of wondrous stature and beauty, who sat and played upon a reed. And when not only the shepherds flocked to hear him, but many of the soldiers left their posts, and among them some of the trumpeters, the apparition snatched a trumpet from one of them, rushed to the river, and sounding the war note with mighty blast, strode to the opposite bank. Then Caesar cried, take we the course which the signs of the gods and the false dealing of our foes point out. The die is cast. Now you might first notice the die is cast, which is the famous saying, we are in, we're going in, this is it, we decided on this course of action. But you should also notice the depiction of Caesar in this section. So he's first shown as doubtful, which is the last time I checked was not necessarily a characteristic of a Roman military commander who we want to imitate or at least look up to. But I think that this is actually a huge move that's potentially controversial. To start a civil war is very far from ideal. And so he is doubtful, but then his doubt will get resolved. How? By getting a divine sign. And I think I'm personally not big on believing that such apparitions appear to famous commanders before they go into battle. It might be helpful to think about this as a way of expressing something, right? That he felt a divine calling or something that he represented as a divine calling to pursue this civil war. But instead it gets depicted as this sort of divine figure appearing and sounding the war note on these military trumpets. And so it sort of gives us a sense of the kind of justifications we can now get for some action, right? In the case of the emperors, they don't necessarily have to explain, I considered, the potential loss of life, the benefits, the unfairness of Pompeii, or anything like that. Instead, we get a divine sign, which sort of is the Jolly Joker card that we can pull out, and that will explain everything. Another aspect of Suetonius's biographies, in addition to the inclusion of such divine details, or also the little verse that we have seen earlier, which is really gives us a lot of insight into thinking at this time, is further details about figures such as Julius Caesar and other later emperors. So in depicting Caesar's triumphs in section 37, this is what the description that we get. Having ended the wars, he celebrated 5 triumphs. Notice how we are not just wanting 1 triumph, but 5. Obviously, nobody else had 5 before. 4 in a single month, but at intervals of a few days after vanquishing Scipio and another on defeating Pompey's sons. By the way, triumphs for defeating other Romans. Any thoughts on that? Interesting. The first and most splendid was the Gallic triumph, the next the Alexandrian, then the Pontic, and after that the African, and finally the Spanish. And it's interesting, so they will name these triumphs after the area that was conquered. Obviously, Gallic triumph for his wars in Gaul. Well, what's interesting about the other ones is that it could also just reference where he fought instead of whom he fought. Because if we say African or Spanish, then we are not saying, oh, and incidentally, those were Romans that we happened to beat because this was a civil war. And so this is a very elegant way of avoiding saying that. Anyways, so all these triumphs, 5 triumphs, each differing from the rest in its equipment and display of spoils. He mounted the Capitol by torchlight with 40 elephants bearing lambs on his right and his left. In his Pontic triumph, he displayed among the showpieces of the procession an inscription of but 3 words: I came, I saw, I conquered, not indicating the events of the war as the others did, but the speed with which it was finished. And now this is something, again, that sort of adds to our sense of these great men, right? So there is the divine inspiration or calling or special fortune of the gods are supporting, being on your side. In addition to that, we will also see this sort of fantasy of speed, that you're just doing things so speedily. So the famous saying, I came, I saw, I conquered, Veni, Vidi, Vici, in fact implies that speed of conquest and how successfully Caesar essentially just went and bulldozed all these areas and succeeded in military terms. In chapter 44 of Suetonius' Life of Julius Caesar, this is the text we get. All these enterprises and plans, about which we're going to talk later, were cut short by his death. But before I speak of that, it will not be amiss to describe briefly his personal appearance, his dress, his mode of life, and his character, as well as his conduct in civil and military life. So this is the section where we sort of shift, right? So before I talk about the death, I'm going to interrupt my chronological depiction now, and I'm going to go into my categories. And so it's interesting to observe the categories in the life of Caesar. So these include family origin, circumstances of birth, often with various omens. Usually there's some sign that's occurring, again, with the religious element, something about the childhood. And then there is the career, how they entered into public life, how they became a singular leading figure, and then various aspects of their government, legislation, behavior as magistrate, public works, games, wars, and then certain personal aspects such as private and public behavior. Were they nice to their wives? Were they good friends? Also stuff about their appearance, what they looked like. This is a period when people start to think about sort of how you look might sort of tell others something about your character, which is not necessarily true, but it was definitely something that individuals were interested in hearing about. And then also character and certain virtues, you know, like, are you the kind of guy, you know, that I could trust and want to be friends with? So this is how a life comes together. And the last bit is then the assessment. And so this is what we get from Suetonius on the assessment of Caesar. He certainly showed admirable self-restraint and mercy, both in his conduct of the civil war and in the hour of victory. So that's an interesting way of putting the fact that somebody did start a civil war, you know, that they had self-restraint and mercy. But in fact, this is a very important thing about Caesar, is that he was very famous for trying to practice clemency, right? That was something he really wanted to do. He wanted to forgive his enemies and say, just join my side and you're good. And then finally, this is Suetonius' assessment. Yet after all, his other actions and words so turn the scale that it is thought that he abused his power and was justly slain. For not only did he accept excessive honors, such as an uninterrupted consulship, the dictatorship for life, and the censorship of public morals, as well as the forename imperator, the surname of father of his country, a statue among those of the kings, and a raised couch in the orchestra, which is sort of like the gods. But he also allowed honors to be bestowed on him, which were too great for mortal men. For a mortal man, a golden throne in the house, that is the Senate house, and on the judgment seat, a chariot and litter in the procession at the circus, again being like a god, temples, altars, and statues beside those of the gods, a special priest to the worship of Julius Caesar, an additional college of the Luperci, which is a priesthood to be serving this cult of Caesar, and the calling of one of the months by his name. You know this, July, right? Julius, July. In fact, there were no honors which he didn't receive or confer at pleasure. So on the judgment of Suetonius, Caesar ultimately pushed too far. But it's worth noticing that Suetonius's view is that Caesar was not necessarily so bad about the civil war, that part was sort of okay. But the problem was that when he won, he started to take on very excessive individual powers. And that's the part that makes him most like an emperor, but that's also the part that was very hard for other fellow senators to accept. And that's where he says that was too much, and maybe he was justly slain. We will pick up the story to understand how Caesar exactly gets there and what those honors were in lecture 3.